Hello, you're very welcome here. My name is Annette Hunter. On this channel, I talk about how our early experiences shape how we feel about ourselves. And I draw on both my professional background and my own personal experience. If you are new here, I want to explain what I call the 6 bad messages, because many of my videos are about how these, what I call bad messages, they control what we think about ourselves. So, from my own experience, I realised that a toxic childhood teaches us damaged core beliefs about ourselves. So, how did I come up with the 6 bad messages? One day, I sat down and I made myself write down what I really thought about myself. That was a thing to do, right? I was shocked by what I saw. This is what I wrote. I wrote about myself that I am not enough. I am responsible for others. I must not trust my feelings and my instincts. I am bad and I am wrong. I am alone. Nobody loves me. And lastly, I must be perfect or nobody will love me. I called these 6 core beliefs the 6 bad messages. And I'm going to help you understand them better. There's a playlist on the whole topic of 6 bad messages, and I've loads of real life examples in that playlist. The 6 bad messages, they quietly shape our choices, our behaviour in all areas of our lives without us even realising it. And why don't we realise that these bad messages are shaping our lives? How don't we know this is happening? It's because we are living through a toxic childhood. We learn these 6 bad messages when we're going through a toxic childhood, and it's all done subconsciously. Why does this happen? A child can never blame its carers for treating them badly because a child is totally dependent on its carers. So what does the child do? It turns the blame inward and feels it must be the problem. So a child blames itself for any problems in their environment. So, for example, a child who is constantly criticised will subconsciously learn to believe that they must be bad or they must be always wrong. And that's how the 4th bad message develops. A child, it doesn't even know it's learning this bad message, as again, it's all done subconsciously. And it's done in an attempt to survive the difficult environment that the child is in, and they can't blame their parents. So we learn these 6 bad messages subconsciously in a difficult childhood, and the sad thing is, these bad messages then follow us all the way into our adult lives. And again, this happens subconsciously. We have no control over this. So as adults, the 6 bad messages subconsciously control how we think about ourselves and how we behave. And the other really sad thing about the 6 bad messages is this. If you are constantly feeding yourselves these bad messages, can you see how you will have absolutely no self-confidence? None. For example, if your subconscious mind is constantly telling you that you are alone and nobody loves you, or you are not enough, or you must be bad, or you must be wrong, you will never feel confident in yourself and you will never be able to even like yourself. So having these 6 bad messages constantly telling you how faulty you are, it's a really hard way to go through life. Up till my mid-40s, I had been constantly getting myself into toxic and abusive situations. And I was really tired of living my life that way. But I didn't know why this was happening. I didn't know what was going on. Then I was very lucky to meet a therapist called Pat O'Connor. He was the first person to gently show me that I was subconsciously repeating familiar but toxic patterns that I had learned in my childhood. Pat O'Connor giving me this awareness marked the beginning of my healing, because without it, I would still be repeating those very same toxic patterns today without understanding why. My therapist, Pat, He introduced me to an idea that completely changed how I understood my life. He helped me see patterns that I had never recognized before. And over time, I learned how to apply these insights into my own life. After Pat helped me see that I was repeating toxic patterns from my childhood, I began asking him questions. I began to explore the area to understand it more. And I wanted to understand why I had kept doing this over up to my 40s. And I wanted, more important, to know how I could stop doing it. So in this video, I'm going to tell you the questions I asked Pat and what I learned from his replies. So here's the first question I asked Pat. I asked him, why is it so important to recognize that you are repeating toxic patterns? And Pat helped me to see that the adult struggles are often patterned. They're not random. So the bad things that happen to us are not random. They're patterns. Apart from, disasters and that you can't predict. Children learn what they live. This is what he explained. Children learn what they live. And all the rules about love, safety and self-worth, we learn them all in our childhood without even knowing it. And these rules become our normal. They're what we're familiar with. So as adults, again, we're subconsciously programmed to gravitate in our adult lives to what is familiar to us, even if it hurts us. We don't even know we are doing this. As I keep saying the word subconscious, but it's really important because it's all subconscious. If someone wasn't going to tell me I was repeating toxic patterns learned in my childhood, I'd still be doing it. But thankfully, this is where Pat came in. He gave me what I call an awareness of what I was doing. And I have now learned that awareness is the first step to healing. Why? Because awareness changes the question from why do I keep making the same mistakes to what toxic pattern am I repeating here? And once we can see the pattern, change becomes possible. Now I'm going to tell you the second question I asked Pat, and it leads on from him explaining toxic patterns to me. As it's the same process, again, it's subconscious. I asked him, that concept you hear, repetition compulsion. I asked him, what is repetition compulsion? He explained it as follows. Repetition compulsion is the umbrella or overall process by which adults are subconsciously programmed to repeat what they learned in their childhood. So this process covers everything we learn, including toxic patterns and bad messages, which I explained the toxic patterns in the first question. And I explained bad messages in the beginning. It all goes back to the way children learn what they live. It's all based on that. And as adults, we are subconsciously programmed to repeat in our adult lives everything we learned as children. So here's an example of repetition compulsion. If you learned as a child that love was unpredictable or unsafe or unavailable growing up, that might later lead you drawn to similar dynamics in your relationships without even knowing that this is happening. It's not a choice and it's not a flaw. It's subconscious learning. And this is why it's so important that someone tell you if you are under the subconscious control of this process called repetition compulsion. As this awareness brings the process into your conscious mind. And once something becomes conscious, we finally have choice as we can control what is in our conscious mind. I have a playlist which gives you real life examples of repetition compulsion, and it's called Tales of Repetition Compulsion. And this playlist, it'll help you understand how repeating what we learned in our childhood impacts every area of our adult lives. So here's the third question I asked Pat. This one is scary. Would I still be repeating these toxic patterns if Pat hadn't told me I was doing this? If he hadn't made me aware that I was doing this? And the answer is yes. No amount of education or success or reading or looking it up on the internet, no amount of that protects us from subconscious toxic patterns. Someone has to tell you if you are under the control of this subconscious force called repetition compulsion. They have to explain it to you. Because it's all subconscious. So without recognizing it, your life can, if you don't know you're under the control of this, your life can feel like it's just bad luck repeating itself. The moment I became aware that I was repeating toxic patterns I learned in my childhood, that became a massive turning point in my life. I was now able to stop doing this, as again I had moved it from a subconscious process to one that I had control over to a conscious process. And I can control what's in my conscious mind. And here's the fourth question I asked Pat. Why didn't he need every detail of my childhood when I was talking to him in therapy? So when I was having therapy with Pat, he didn't need to hear all the details of what I experienced as a child. And this was so different from other therapists I had worked with. What I learned from Pat is that some therapists do not always need every single story to understand the impact of an abusive childhood. Because childhood leaves emotional fingerprints and behavioural fingerprints that show up in adult life, in relationships, in boundaries, and in core self-beliefs. And healing comes less from retelling every event and more from understanding the pattern that these experiences created and how changing them in our lives now can actually lead to healing. And here's the fifth question I asked Pat. Pat never let me stay in the helpless victim mode. So I asked him, why was it important that he not let me stay in victim mode position? He explained it as follows. What happened in childhood was not anyone's fault. It's not your fault. It's not my fault. But my adult choices are mine. They are mine to make. I do have a say in those. Moving from this happened to me towards what can I do now to heal it restores agency and empowerment. And this shift leads to you having control. You're not a victim. I liked working with Pat because he made me feel stronger. I didn't feel a victim and I felt in control of my destiny. And here's the sixth question I asked Pat. When I first met Pat, I told you I was under the control of the 6 bad messages, which I explained at the start of this video. And all I ever did, if you think of the 6 bad messages, was put myself down. I didn't know I was doing this. So I asked Pat, why was changing my inner critic so powerful? And he helped me see that my hypercritical inner voice was learned in childhood. When I was a child, I couldn't criticize my carers as I was totally dependent on them. I couldn't give out about them. So instead, I began to subconsciously criticize myself and make myself out to be the problem. I blamed myself for all the problems in my environment. And this is how I learned what I call the 6 bad messages. And these bad messages are learned subconsciously in a toxic childhood and they follow us into our adult lives. They are a constant inner critic and it is all done, again, subconsciously. So once again, Pat, he showed me that how I was constantly putting myself down, criticizing myself. So again, now that I had an awareness of this, it enabled me to stop doing it. And I developed what I now call the nip and flip method. And that knocked out my inner critic. And I'll tell you more about that. I'll put a video in the pinned comments explaining this method. And you know what? I can confidently say that it really works because I have been doing nip and flip for many years now. And I am a testimony to the fact that it works because I hardly ever criticize myself these days. I don't put myself down. Now, I'm not boasting and I'm not super confident. I didn't go the other extreme. But I've come to a place where I actually have confidence. And I actually like myself. I mean, that's a miracle. When we keep using nip and flip, the brain begins to learn what I call good messages. And over time, the bad messages start to fade. They really do fade. Nip and flip has made a huge impact on my healing, and I'd like to think the same will happen for you. And lastly, here's the 7th question I asked Pat, and it was, how should someone choose a therapist for this kind of work? This is a really important question, as if a therapist can't see that you are repeating subconscious toxic patterns you learned in your childhood, then you'll just keep doing this. You need a therapist who's able to make you aware that you are doing this, as again, it's a subconscious process. And how can you stop doing something that is harming you if you don't even know you're doing it? Someone has to tell you. And maybe that someone is me today. Hopefully, this might be your first time to be aware that you might be repeating toxic patterns. What Pat taught me is that the therapists, they don't need to be super duper fancy, super duper expensive, super duper up to psychological research and complicated terminology, but they should have a solid understanding of how subconscious toxic patterns learned in childhood follow us into our adult lives. They have to know that and understand it and be able to get it across to you. The therapist needs to know how toxic childhood experiences shape our adult behaviour. If you think you might be repeating toxic patterns that you learned as a child, a simple, helpful question to ask a prospective therapist is something like this. Ask them, how do you help people recognise and change repeating toxic patterns they learned in their childhood? So I'll summarise now. The most important thing Pat helped me understand is this. If you recognise these toxic patterns in yourself, it does not mean something is wrong with you. It's not your fault because it's subconscious. You don't know you're doing it. And it's what you learned in your childhood subconsciously. So you're not flawed. You're doing something that you don't even know you're doing. But for healing to happen, you have to be given an awareness. Someone has to tell you that you are doing this, because the first step to healing is really basic. The first step is awareness. Once you are aware that you are repeating toxic patterns you learned in your childhood, healing happens through small, repeated changes over time. You start noticing your toxic patterns and you start to challenge them. And you start to challenge the 6 bad messages so you can knock out your inner critic. So over time, you stop doing toxic patterns and you silence the 6 bad messages. You silence your inner critic. You actually start to like yourself, and you start to see that any bad choices or bad decisions you made in your life, they weren't your fault, as you were not aware that you were under the control of repetition compulsion and the 6 bad messages. When you start to break free from being under the control of these subconscious hidden forces, life really does start to become so much easier and so much more enjoyable. Because you're no longer getting yourself into toxic and abusive situations where you're going to get hurt and exploited. And you're finally starting to be able to like yourself and believe in yourself. And you know what? That's healing. If you feel ready, have a look at my video called Healing, My Story. I'll put it on the screen now and also maybe in the pinned comment. Look, thank you for staying this far. I really appreciate it, and I really hope it helps. Thank you.